Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about 3 common reasons for self-sabotage. Alright, so in this video I'm going to be talking to you about 3 very common reasons for self-sabotage, probably the most common ones that I've seen, and basically I'm going to be giving you some examples and how to remedy these reasons for self-sabotage. And ultimately what self-sabotage is where we consciously want something, but we find ourselves always throwing obstacles in the way of us getting what we want or going toward what we want. And so in order to understand self-sabotage, we have to understand the workings of the shadow. So the shadow is basically almost like a dark closet in the unconscious mind where we fragment off parts of ourselves and we put them away to forget about them. So basically it's like where we repress aspects of ourselves. And when we do this, these aspects become autonomous from the conscious personality and they end up having their own wants and needs and wisdom and agendas and fears separate from, let's say, the conscious personalities, like let's say wants and needs and wisdom and agendas and fears. And so these aspects basically function like their own being that exists within your psyche, but they're still very much you. So your conscious personality can want to go in one direction, and you can have 5 different shadow aspects in the shadow where one wants to go in this direction, another wants to go in that direction, another one wants to go in this direction. And so it can lead to a lot of agenda clashes whenever it's the case that we have aspects that are in the shadow. And so because of these agenda clashes, this is often where self-sabotage comes from. And so really the long and short of it, the one reason why we self-sabotage is because we have aspects in the shadow that are, let's say, trying to go in a different direction from the conscious personalities, like let's say goals, and let's say the direction that it wants to go in. But as an offshoot of this general reason for self-sabotage, there are 3 common reasons why a given shadow aspect might want to sabotage the conscious personality's agenda, which is what I'll be sharing in this video. Now, one of the things that's important to keep in mind when it comes to self-sabotage is that, at the baseline level, all aspects of yourself will always have a fundamental, self-interest. So I call this the rule of benevolent intention. You will never have a shadow aspect come in and sabotage you just for the sake of sabotaging you. There's always going to be some kind of self-interested motive that exists underneath that sabotage, which then takes away all of the thoughts of oh no, I'm just trying to mess myself over. Why am I trying to mess myself up? Ultimately, if a part of you is sabotaging you, it thinks it's doing the right thing. Now, it might not be doing the right thing. It might be leading you into a path that you really don't want to go down, but from its perspective, it thinks that it's either protecting you or serving you in some way. So all aspects of yourself, including the aspects that reside there in the shadow, have a fundamental self-interest, which means they have a desire to serve your best interests. So with this in mind, I'll be sharing you the 3 most common reasons why I find that shadow aspects try to sabotage the conscious personality's agenda. But before that, I just wanted to mention something really quick. So basically back in July, I started a membership site called the Consciousness Workers Club, where I give monthly live classes and monthly live group coaching sessions. And there's also a forum where you can interact with me and other like-minded people. And basically it's like every month I also record the classes and the coaching calls, which are Q&A calls. And so basically every month there'll be a growing catalog of content that's exclusive to members of the Consciousness Workers Club. And so if this is something you think you might be interested in, I have a link down below to where you can get on the waiting list for the Consciousness Workers Club. I only open it up once a season, so I opened it up the first week of July, and the next time I'll open up enrollment will be the first week of October. And so if you want to get notifications about the Consciousness Workers Club, you can go ahead and put your name down and your email down on the waiting list, and I'll make sure that you get informed whenever enrollment opens up for the club. So without further ado, let me go into the first reason as to why a shadow aspect might sabotage the agendas and goals of the conscious personality, which is ultimately because that shadow aspect feels like its needs will be compromised if the conscious personality succeeds at that goal. So let's say that there's a guy named Bill. And Bill is somebody who thinks about himself as a loner, somebody who doesn't really need people, somebody who doesn't really like to be around people that much. He really likes his solitude. And ultimately, like right now, Bill doesn't have a lot of money, and so he is like living with roommates, and he's having to carpool to go to work, and he has to do his laundry at the laundromat, where he also has to interact with lots of people. And basically, it's like the only reason why he's interacting socially is because he's kind of strapped for cash. He doesn't have a lot of money. But Bill has a goal. And basically, Bill's goal consciously is that he wants to start his own business so that he can so he can make more money and become financially free, financially independent. And his whole thought is like, okay, yeah, once I start making a lot of money, I can have my own place out in the countryside where there's nobody else around me for miles, and I can let's say have my own car, and I can have my own washer and dryer, and I can be, super independent. And right now it's such a drag to be dependent on people. But what Bill doesn't know is that he has, let's say, a repressed aspect of himself that does value social connection, that wants friendship, that wants connection to people, and in fact that needs connection to people. And so this aspect that's in the shadow has a need for connection that is currently being served by Bill not having a lot of cash. The need is currently being served by him not doing well in his business. And so because Bill doesn't have any sense of this deeper need, this aspect is truly in the shadow. As he tries to, let's say, work on his business, maybe he finds himself self-sabotaging, he finds himself procrastinating, he finds himself making stupid mistakes, not taking opportunities as they arise. And so basically, he might be quite perplexed as to, okay, well, if I want to create this business, why is it that I'm sabotaging things? Maybe certain opportunities have even come up for him to make a great deal of money. And, because of, let's say, his shadow aspect, kind of like almost like throwing banana peels in his way, he maybe didn't take those opportunities, or maybe didn't even notice those opportunities as they came up. So if Bill doesn't become conscious of this aspect that needs social connection, and if he doesn't directly try to meet those needs in a conscious way, this aspect will kind of creep in whichever way that it can to try to keep him stuck in the situation where he has to live with roommates, and he has to continue carpooling to work, and he has to continue going to the laundromat and interacting with people. Whereas if Bill wants to actually move forward with his goal of becoming financially independent, he has to be able to, let's say, give this aspect an assurance that those needs are actually going to be met. So maybe he can kind of tweak his vision of like, okay, well, here's the thing, I'm going to become financially independent, but I'm going to use that financial independence actually to have more valuable interactions with people. I'm going to make sure that I use it to have more social experiences, along with having the house that I want and the car that I want. And so if that happens, then this aspect no longer has a reason to sabotage Bill's goals of financial independence. So that's a more extended example of needs-based sabotage, but let me give you a few smaller examples too. So let's say that we find ourselves sabotaging our relationship that we consciously want to be in because there's a shadow aspect of ourselves that feels like that relationship gets in the way of its need for freedom. Or let's say that we have the conscious goal of wanting to do really well at our workplace, but we keep on sabotaging and turning in subpar work and not getting things done on time, and it's because maybe a particular shadow aspect of ours feels like this work gets in the way of its need for authenticity. Or let's say we keep trying to improve ourselves in some way, but we keep sabotaging ourselves because there's a shadow aspect of ours that feels like our goals towards self-improvement are getting in the way of its need for unconditional self-acceptance. Now, in order to remedy self-sabotage that comes about because of needs-based conflicts, I have a few steps that you can follow. So the first one is that you want to name off the sabotaging aspect. So if we look at, let's say, Bill's example, where we have this aspect that needs connection, and basically it keeps sabotaging his goals toward financial independence because it senses that he's not going to meet those needs if he becomes financially independent. So we could name this aspect, let's say connection wanting Bill, so it's the part of him that wants connection. All right, and step number 2 is to determine the benevolent motive, the benevolent self-interested motive behind the sabotage. So in Bill's example, it's the case that sabotage of his financial goals, even though he consciously doesn't like that, there's part of him that's like, wait a second, I want to keep us having our social and emotional needs met. And if we do this, we're not going to get our needs met, and that's not going to be good for us. So the motive there is actually very benevolent. And then the third step in this part of the process is to intuit the core need. So basically with Bill's aspect that needs connection, it's pretty straightforward. Connection is what's needed. And so he has to be conscious of the fact that he needs connection, which might take a little bit of, let's say, working with, let's say, his own identity and his own worldview to open up to the possibility that he does need social connection. And then from there, what Bill will want to do is he'll want to incorporate the need for social connection into his goal. So right now, his goal is a business goal, it's a financial goal, it has to do with independence, which those are perfectly fine for him to want, but he has to be able to weave in the needs of this aspect that's there in the shadow. Otherwise, this aspect will be like an anchor that will keep holding him back from all those other things that he wants to achieve. All right, so that's it for the first reason for self-sabotage. Now, the second reason why a particular shadow aspect might want to sabotage our conscious personality's goals and agenda is because that aspect is afraid or nervous of experiencing some kind of negative side effect or outcome as a result of the conscious personality achieving that goal. This is often wrapped up in a desire to avoid feelings like failure or avoid shame or avoid some kind of trauma that's already happened in the past. All right, so let's say that there's a guy named Alex, and Alex has the conscious goal that he wants to find a relationship with somebody that he can settle down with and have children with. And so he goes out on a variety of different dates, and what he finds is that he is always like sabotaging anything that kind of comes up, right? So it's sort of like, maybe he'll really like somebody, but he'll show up late to the date, or he'll ghost, or he'll just, become wrapped up in his own thing, or he'll suddenly become uninterested, or, maybe he's got a big laundry list of traits that he requires from a partner, and there's like 100 things on the list, and unless somebody meets all 100 of those things, he's going to like say no, the grass is greener on the other side. And so even when he finds himself genuinely interested in sparking up a relationship with someone, there's always these kind of sabotaging factors coming in. And let's say that Alex realizes this is a pattern of his. And so he is aware that he consciously wants a relationship, and he knows that he's sabotaging himself, but he's not sure why. So basically, this would be important to note that back in childhood, it was frequent that Alex's parents weren't very responsible. And so they had a tendency to, let's say, neglect him and maybe even like leave them at his grandparents' house. And they just weren't very attentive. They weren't very tuned in. And so he basically felt this deep sense of unworthiness and abandonment from childhood. And when he experienced this feeling of rejection and abandonment from his parents, this split off an aspect of himself that bore the brunt of that trauma that ended up down in the shadow. And so this aspect is like constantly feeling abandoned, constantly feeling unworthy, constantly feeling rejected. And this aspect is down in the shadow, so he's not consciously aware of this aspect. But let's say that whenever he is, let's say, looking for a relationship, once he notices himself even getting like a little bit attached to the other person, he has some kind of mechanism for rejecting that person. So it's basically like, he basically abandons the other person before they can abandon him, or he devalues the other person before they feel like they have this power to devalue him. And so there's this part of him that's operating from the shadow that's trying to avoid those feelings of abandonment and rejection and unworthiness by basically keeping his romantic partners at arm's length and finding some way to reject them first. So in order for Alex to actually actualize his conscious goal of getting married and being in a healthy relationship and having children one day, what he would have to do is he would have to look deeply at that part of himself that feels that sense of rejection, abandonment, and unworthiness, and to process through the trauma from that time period. Because otherwise, what will happen is he's got all these protection mechanisms to avoid feeling those feelings. And so when you get very connected to somebody, like in a romantic relationship, it's like that person has, some kind of emotional power, in the situation. And if they decide to break up when you really care about that person, it's like that's enough to create a trigger to bring up all of those really intensely negative emotions from childhood again. All right, so let me give you a few smaller examples here. So let's say that a person has a conscious goal of, let's say, being very successful, and maybe success to them would mean being kind of like, let's say, kind of a high profile person. It's like maybe they would become like the CEO of some company and now they're going to be on the radar. And so maybe there's a part of them that wants to sabotage that because they have an aspect of themselves that's like, oh no, we need to be off the radar, because whenever we were noticed by our family members when we were children, what would happen is that we'd get all sorts of, let's say, scrutiny and judgment and comparisons. And then it's like, oh, if we didn't do as well as they wanted to, maybe they would feel disappointed and we would experience the negative outcomes of their disappointment. Or maybe we have the conscious goal of wanting to travel abroad, but we find ourselves sabotaging that because there's an aspect of ourself that's dealing with feelings of unsafety. And so this aspect wants us to kind of stay home and to stay in a place that's familiar and comfortable and safe. Or let's say that we consciously want to end our relationship. The relationship's not working anymore, but there's an aspect of the self that wants to hold on to the relationship because it fears the feeling of guilt of, let's say, abandoning the other person. And so in order to avoid guilt, that aspect is basically holding on to the relationship that's no longer serving us. So if you're dealing with self-sabotage that comes up as a way to avoid negative circumstances or negative outcomes of some kind, or to avoid re-traumatization, then here's some steps that you can follow. So the first one is to name off the sabotaging aspect. So in the case of the extended example with Alex, Alex's sabotaging aspect is an aspect of him that's a vulnerable aspect that feels rejected and abandoned and unworthy. So we could name off that aspect for any of these qualities. Let's call it abandoned Alex, so that he has this abandoned aspect that's there in the shadow. And then step 2 is to determine the benevolent motive for the sabotage. And so in the case of Alex, it's sort of like this aspect is sabotaging the relationships. It's like avoiding attachment to other people, because when you get attached to other people, they can abandon you and reject you and make you feel unworthy. So it's this aspect's way of avoiding re-traumatization, avoiding those deeper feelings of pain. And then step number 3 that you can follow is to ask the following question. So if the negative outcome arose that the shadow aspect is trying to avoid, what would be so bad about that from the perspective of that shadow aspect? Well, ultimately, this aspect would be brought right back through that same trauma cycle. It would have to feel directly those feelings of rejection and those feelings of unworthiness and the feelings of sadness and distance away from the parents. So it's like on top of the experience of the loss of that particular relationship, there's also the deeper childhood wounds that would come up to the surface as a result of that. All right, and the final step in the process is to, once you discover, let's say, what would be so bad about that, how the shadow aspect would feel if that negative situation were to arise, what you want to do is you want to be proactive and you want to face directly into that part of yourself that's having those feelings. So for example, for Alex, it's, oh, I have this aspect that feels abandoned. Can you sit with the aspect that feels abandoned? Can you experience those feelings of rejection and abandonment and sit with those parts of yourself without abandoning that part? And you can use somatic work to actually do this part in the process. And this usually will take you a while. This isn't like a one and done deal. This is something that will probably take you a while to really work through. I actually have a video on my channel that's about shadow work and somatic work, which is a good starting place. But yeah, if you want to look into somatic work more deeply, there's tons of great resources on YouTube, and ultimately that will help you with the processing through the emotions on the level of the body. All right, so that was the second reason for self-sabotage. Now, the third reason for self-sabotage is definitely the most difficult of the three because it requires the most course correction. And the third reason why a shadow aspect might sabotage your conscious personality's goals and agenda is because it actually knows better than the conscious personality as to what you really truly want. So the example I would give here, so let's say that there's a person named Julie. And let's say that Julie was raised in a family that ran a family plumbing business. And like basically it was like generations, this plumbing business had been in her family. So her great grandfather started it and made it successful and gave it to his son. And then, he gave it to Julie's parents when he went into retirement. And now they're about ready to go into retirement and they'll give it to Julie. And Julie has been primed since the time of like being a child that, oh, one day you're going to be the CEO of this plumbing business. This is going to all be yours. And basically, whenever Julie was a kid and she expressed excitement about that, and she would get a lot of parental approval. And so her family would really appreciate that she was always wanting to, let's say when she was a teenager, help out with the family business. And, for her, it was like a big way to feel closer to her family. And, so she had this conscious idea that, oh, I really, really want to be the CEO of this business. She consciously felt very grateful for the opportunity, and like her whole idea of herself was of somebody that was going to one day inherit that business. And so this became very deeply ingrained into Julie's identity and worldview, to where she had no idea that there were aspects of herself in the shadow that actually knew that she didn't really want to become the CEO of the plumbing business, but that she would much rather develop her underexplored potentials toward being an architect. But this idea didn't have any space to actually arise in Julie's mind, because ever since she was a child, she just always kind of like, she never really explored any other type of career option or possibility, because she's like, okay, I know what I'm going to do when I grow up. I'm going to be the CEO of the plumbing business. And if Julie were to ever become conscious of these shadow aspects that know that she doesn't really want to lead the plumbing business, but actually wants to do something else, this would be very, very threatening to her identity. It'd be very, very threatening to her worldview, and it would be very, very threatening, or at least feel very, very threatening to her role in her family and her connection to her family. And so she has all sorts of different denial mechanisms, protection mechanisms that are just happening automatically in a way that she doesn't even realize she's engaging in them. But we have this shadow aspect that exists down there that knows the deeper truths of her that she would find very threatening to be in connection with, because it would totally change everything about everything she ever assumed about her life. And so the time came for Julie's parents to go into retirement, and then she actually becomes the CEO of the business, right? And so she is like, it's like a large company that has a lot of different, let's say, smaller companies working under it. And so it requires her to kind of create systems for all the different businesses to go and serve different areas of the broader metropolitan area. And, as she's in this role of being the CEO of the business and doing all the things that requires, she finds herself feeling totally overwhelmed. She finds herself procrastinating. She finds herself making very bad decisions. She finds herself in a state of sabotaging herself, missing obvious things. And what's very difficult about this particular type of self-sabotage is that you can't just work through your unmet needs, or you can't just, like, let's say, make things work out. If you don't want something, you don't want it. And so you have to actually make large structural changes in order to integrate that aspect and in order to avoid the kind of self-sabotage. And so in the best case scenario, what would happen with Julie is that she becomes aware that she actually doesn't want to run the family plumbing business. She does all of the inner work necessary to then start, like, let's say, transitioning out of that line of work and into something that she wants to do much more, and being able to, like, migrate herself in a different direction. But if she's not aware of this aspect that doesn't want to do the work, she's fully unconscious to the fact that she doesn't like doing the work and she wants to do something else, what's probably going to happen is that she's going to sabotage the whole entire business. Maybe in the worst case scenario, she totally tanks the whole entire family business and then it goes out of business. Or like at the very least, like her parents have to take her off and go back in from out of retirement and go back and run the business again. And so when self-sabotage comes up for this reason, it's really, really important to become conscious of what we actually want and how what we're currently doing and what we're currently sabotaging ourselves out at is actually standing in the way of what we want. Because if we don't become aware, what ends up happening is that it sets us up for a really chaotic transition, as opposed to becoming gradually aware of and bringing ourselves through a more gradual transition. So here are some smaller examples. So let's say that we consciously want to be married, but we find ourselves sabotaging all of our relationships before it gets to that point, because part of us actually really wants to be independent and be traveling around the world all the time and wants to not be responsible for another person. Or part of us believes that we're in our dream job, kind of like Julie, but really we actually don't like the job. We would much prefer to be doing something else. We've just invested so much into our identity around that job. And what ends up happening is that we end up getting fired or losing that job and really throwing things away. And so basically we end up sabotaging for that reason. Or let's say similar to like the marriage example, let's say that deep down we really want to be an independent person and our life path means that we're going to, basically be traveling around a lot and we're going to be alone a lot. But consciously, we want to settle down and have kids. Well, ultimately, the settling down and having kids is antithetical to what the actual deeper current of our motivation is. All right, so when it comes to this type of self-sabotage, there are also 4 steps to remedying that. So first off, you want to name off the aspect that basically is trying to sabotage you. And in this case, it's the part of you that knows what you really want. So in other cases, it could be, we could name off aspects for, oh, this aspect has this need, or this aspect is afraid of this outcome. But we could say that this aspect is the aspect that knows what you really want. And then step number 2 is to find out why it doesn't want the conscious goal. So if we consciously want, let's say what Julie wanted, wanting to, let's say, inherit the family business and play that role, it's like it doesn't want that because it stands in the way of her actual passions and her actual untapped potential toward becoming an architect. And then step number 3 is to find out what it actually wants. And in this case, for Julie, it's like, oh, she wants to become an architect. And so then step 4 from there is to course correct, to actually find ways to transition smoothly out of the business and into going to school to be an architect so that she can move in the direction of, let's say, her internal current. All right, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe and leave me a comment down below. Also, if you're interested in potentially joining the Consciousness Workers Club membership site, there is the link down below in the description box and in the comments section. And basically, like I said, I won't be opening up enrollment until October. I only open enrollment like once per season for a week. And basically, I opened it up in July, so my next time opening up will be in October. So if you want to get updates and you want to know when that's going to open up, I'm going to leave that link down below. Also, if you would like to learn about the shadow, I have a free shadow integration masterclass called the 6 Simple Steps to Shadow Integration. And you can access that for free by going to shadowintegration.org/masterclass. Anyway, that's all I have for you for now. And until next time, keep becoming more you.